Hi everyone, welcome to the Week 10 online lecture part 2. Today we're going to talk about emotional development and the development of the self. Okay, so let's talk emotional development. So what we know about emotional development first is that attachment pattern can be really linked to emotional development. So we talked about attachment patterns last time in part 1 of this lecture. And so remember when children were insecurely attached, remember they could either be resistant or avoidant. If they're insecurely attached, they're more likely to be more fearful in general, and they can also respond with distress to happy events. So for example, maybe a birthday party might trigger some sadness or unpleasant feelings instead of a happy feeling. And so that's one example of how emotional development is really linked to the type of attachment pattern that a child has. So one thing that's important to note in emotional development is this idea of social referencing. So social referencing is just the simple act of looking for another person's reaction in a situation so that you know what your own response should be. So think about sometimes if you've ever seen your child or a child in your care fall down and scrape their knee. Sometimes they'll look at you and they'll look at you and they won't say anything, but if your reaction is one of horror and you're kind of like, oh my gosh, no, then the child will start to cry and know that this is a bad situation, that they're really hurt. On the other hand, when that child falls down and scrapes their knee and you see that, it's just a minor scrape, it's not anything, it's no big deal, you might react with, it's okay, you're all right, now brush it off, go play. And by looking at you and seeing that your reaction wasn't one of extreme distress, then they'll mimic that reaction. Well, I was going to ask if anybody's ever had that happen, but you guys can't answer me right now. But think about if that's ever happened to you, because I imagine that if you haven't done it to a child, your parents might have done it to you. And so this social referencing is displayed as early as 6 months. So infants pick up on this at a pretty young age. And the way that you can notice it at 6 months is by their friendliness or wariness of strangers. So when there's a stranger in the room, like this baby in the picture, there's a doctor, taking her heartbeat. Baby's looking over at her mom to see, okay, mom, is this a safe person or is this somebody I'm supposed to be wary of? And mom's smiling, making eye contact with the doctor, so baby could probably conclude that, all right, this doctor is indeed a safe person. I can trust her to check my heartbeat. And the other example that is the one I just gave you. So if a child falls down and gets hurt, a parent or caregiver's reaction can sort of shape what their emotional response is going to be if they're sort of teetering on that edge. Okay, so another thing that develops in early childhood is emotion regulation. So I know we've talked about this sort of in passing in this class before, but let's look at a real definition of it. So a definition of emotion regulation is the ways in which young children can control their own emotions. So whether or not they're really in charge of their emotions. And so one way this plays out is staying calm in the face of frustration. And so if you think about a 3 or a 2-year-old, if they're upset about something, like say they're trying to put together a puzzle and they just can't get the pieces to go together, then they might have a total meltdown. It might be meltdown city because, hey, they don't have any emotion regulation at that point. But as the child gets older, maybe 4 or 5 years old, they start to learn some strategies. They start to pick up on, hey, well, what do the other human beings do when they get frustrated? Maybe they take a deep breath. Maybe they just try to work through it. Maybe they say an angry word, but then they keep going for it. And so being able to learn to be calm in the face of frustration is a real hallmark of emotion regulation. And it's also very closely tied to brain development. So when certain regions of the brain start to develop, then emotion regulation starts to come online as well. And also, something positive about secure attachment is that it can really lead to better emotion regulation. So that's another advantage of having secure attached infants, that it carries over into early childhood and later on to get kids prepared to regulate their emotions in a socially acceptable and adaptive way. Okay, so let's talk about the self. So one thing that you should know about the self is the idea of self-concept. And self-concept is just understanding that we are separate and distinct from the world outside. So what you like isn't necessarily what other people like. And so maybe you really start to understand that your favorite food is crackers, Ritz crackers maybe are the things that just you love the most. And you can maybe start to understand that, hey, your best friend doesn't really like Ritz crackers the way that you like Ritz crackers. Maybe your best friend likes Wheat Thins, and that's their favorite kind of cracker. And so you're really kind of understanding that what you like is different than what other people like. And before kids develop self-concept, they really don't know that. And on a more rudimentary level, self-concept is just kind of an awareness or an understanding of the self. And one way that self-concept is measured is through what's called the Rouge test. And so the Rouge test is given to infants at or before 18 months. And what they do is they sneakily put a little dot of makeup on a child's forehead or on their nose. And they might do it in a way that the child doesn't even notice. And then they place a mirror in front of the child, or they strategically put a mirror where the child is going to go to it. And what happens is, if the child has developed self-concept, they'll look at the image in the mirror and see that there's something on their nose and try to wipe it off. They'll touch their own nose on their own face. They won't touch the mirror. They'll physically put their hand to their own nose, knowing that the image that they see in the mirror represents the image of themselves. It's themselves. And so around 18 months, this self-concept begins to develop. Another way, another hallmark of the self-development is identifying themselves by the use of I or using their own name. So by around 2 years, infants can identify themselves in photos, and they can say, okay, that's me, or that's I, or that's the baby, or that's Flora. When Flora was little, when she was about 2 years old, I would show her a lot of pictures on my phone. I remember I had just gotten a smartphone. It was pretty cool. And I was showing a lot of pictures, and she'd say, well, there's the baby, or where's the baby? Or then it kind of progressed into, well, that's me in that picture. And so she really started to understand that, hey, that image she sees is indeed her. And so another important thing to know about the development of self-awareness is that it really has an impact on social and emotional development. So when kids start to understand that they are an individual person, it really starts to facilitate development of sharing and cooperative behaviors. So kids can start to interact differently with other kids. So if they know that they really like Ritz crackers and their friend also really likes Ritz crackers, then hey, maybe your friend would like some Ritz crackers too. Other people would be happy with Ritz crackers. So you're kind of starting to rudimentarily understand that that is something somebody else would want to have. And having self-awareness also has a drawback because it also can facilitate the development of other new types of emotions that weren't available to a child before. Emotions like embarrassment, envy, empathy, pride, guilt, and shame. These things start to come around when kids are developing their self-concept. So it's really important in our interactions with children to be sensitive to this, because the first time that you feel guilt and shame is a pretty powerful feeling. So it's important for those of us who work with children to be very sensitive and aware that kids are starting to experience these feelings and to navigate social situations accordingly. Okay, now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about what you're going to do next. So this is the end of part 1 and part 2 of the lecture.